Tri-Cities. It's Friday at 9 o'clock, and it's time for Coffee with Karl. I'm Karl Dye from TRIDEC, and we've got a great program set up today. Today, we're going to be talking about what's going on back in Washington, D.C. We've got our own lobbyist, Mr. Tim Peckinpaugh. He's a partner with PNNL Gates. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning. Great to be here.
I hope lobbyist doesn't carry any, connotations that you're not comfortable with. How should we refer to you, Tim?
Lobbyist is fine. It's an honor, quite frankly. I'm advocating for the community, and I know it's a loaded term by some, but it's in the Constitution after all. It's a protected right to redress your grievances and to lobby on your own behalf and on behalf of clients in this case. So absolutely, I see it as an honorable profession if done correctly in accordance with the rules. So it doesn't bug me at all. I prefer it.
All right. No, well, it's great to have you, and you do an amazing job for us. We long time relationship, and it's great to have you on this morning. We also have our own David Reeploeg, who's our Vice President of Federal Programs. Good morning, David.
Good morning. Good to be here once again.
All right. Well, we should have a good discussion this morning over a cup of coffee. We'll get our coffee mug started off, and mine's, sorry, it's vertical. But I pulled out my Cascade natural gas coffee mug. David and I think both got these when we worked with them last year on an issue in Olympia. But Cascade Natural Gas is a great partner of ours. They've been on the board for many, many years, and in the past, and of course, because I'm still kind of new, it's within the last 10 or so years, Cascade Natural Gas actually moved their corporate headquarters from the west side of Washington to Kennewick, actually. So great company. Want to give them a plug this morning with their mug. Let's go to Tim next. What do you got for a mug for us this morning?
Well, I actually have a TRIDEC mug, and I was at the TRIDEC offices yesterday, and with your help, I was able to scrounge up this mug, which I'm told talks about or tries to showcase when TRIDEC got its first website. So it actually is www.tridec.org, the mug says. So very appropriate. I think the mug is probably about 15, 20 years old. It actually, I predate the mug, I have to admit. I've been involved with TRIDEC now for well over 30 years, again, based in Washington, D.C., advocating on the community's behalf. And I'm very proud that they have a mug that talks about TRIDEC's efforts to join the internet age and have a website and have its own www. So that's outstanding. I have to admit, though, that I was involved with TRIDEC back in the day before the internet, when we actually did things the old-fashioned way with face-to-face meetings and occasional phone calls. So times have changed, but credit to TRIDEC for keeping up with those times.
All right, well, that's great, Tim. We're excited to that you get one of our historic mugs that we pulled out of the archives. David, how about you? What do you got for a mug this morning?
Glad it wasn't the one that was chiseled out of granite that we have laying around there too. So my mug, and I'll preface this, and I think I've maybe had this one on before too, but obviously very big fan of WSU and WSU Tri-Cities and all the great partnerships we have with them, and big fan of WSU Tri-Cities and WSU, and my wife graduated from there, but she and I both also graduated from the University of Washington, and proud Husky graduates. And this is probably the last time I'm going to be on Coffee with Karl before the start of the football season. I believe Saturday after tomorrow, September 4th. And so had to show a little bit of Husky pride. Sorry, Tracy. But a little Husky pride with the old school Husky football helmet, which is awesome. A fairly difficult mug to drink out of too. So you all might watch me spill coffee down my shirt, but it's white, so it probably won't show.
Well, Tim, I know you got some slides that are really good that kind of give us some context on our discussion this morning. But before we get into them, can you remind us of your background? Like, what's the Tim Peckinpaugh backstory? What's your origin and roots, and how did you make it to Washington, D.C. with PNNL Gates?
Well, thank you. I have a relive history here. I grew up in the Tri-Cities way back in the day, Kennewick High School graduate. Sort of my formative experience, if you will, growing up was very much as a Tri-City kid. And left the Tri-Cities for college and for law school, and got really hooked on on Washington, D.C. I actually was an intern for Mike McCormick, who was the congressman in the late 70s, and then came back and had more internships and went to law school in Washington, D.C. at night and worked on Capitol Hill for Sid Morrison, who was the Republican member who replaced Mike, and worked for Sid as his energy Hanford staffer, if you will, for about 3 years, including some time in the House Science and Technology Committee professional staff where Sid was a ranking Republican on the energy subcommittee. So about 5 years of Hill experience before I left the Hill and then joined at the time my firm, which at that time was called Preston Thorgrimson, then became Preston Gates, and then became K&L Gates over a series of mergers and acquisitions, et cetera. Same firm though, and same set of clients. And of course, the very first client was TRIDEC. It was actually called Tripnick at the time when I first got hired, but changed the name very quickly thereafter, and had been engaged ever since, providing advocacy support at the federal level for Tri-City priorities. And of course, there's been a strong focus on Hanford and the laboratory and other federal priorities, big focus on appropriations, and been doing this now for a good number of years, but it's my first client, and I'm proud to say as the first client, my favorite client. And other clients sometimes raise eyebrows when I say that, but I'm proud to say that as the first client, it's the one that I always look to as the go-to, and the first thing I do on my to-do list is trying to figure out what can I do today to support TRIDEC in the community. So that's the Tim Peckinpaugh story, and a real honor again to be on with Coffee with Karl, and more importantly to advocate, for a great community that really has come a long way, and hope to have a lot more good stories to have happen as well.
You bet. And I just have to bring up, because I think you mentioned it yesterday when we were together about being at Kennewick High School, that maybe you're on the debate team, and you had some arch rivals in Gonzaga Prep and maybe a few other college or high school debate teams.
Yeah, that's true. I was part of the nerd class at Kennewick High School, where most were playing sports and doing other traditional high school activities. I was part of a relatively small, modest debate team, and in fact, we got to state and I think finished third at the state tournament my senior year, and debated all the various high schools throughout Washington State, and in fact, I spent some time with a debate partner when I was in Leavenworth just last week, and so anyway, it's been fun, a lot of fun to have that experience, and it was very informative for me to engage in the policy process. And of course, debaters have to advocate and have to present their case, if you will, which is what lobbyists do back in Washington, D.C., and lawyers as well. So it was a great experience. And I recall, in fact, the junior year, that the topic that year was energy policy. So I quickly developed a lot of experience and sort of research abilities, if you will, in the energy R&D areas. So that was also very formative for where I ended up going.
That's great. I think your story and just even the debate team experience that you got really relates to the Tri-Cities, right? Just like you said, energy policy. It's again, me being new, it's just really interesting to hear a lot of the stories about our history as a community and energy, how so much of that discussion's come full circle now with, opportunities that we have with advanced reactors and new nuclear. There's a lot of people in the Tri-Cities here specifically that have put decades of work into kind of keeping the torch alive, if you will. And now it's just great to see that kind of really coming full circle and new opportunities for new nuclear out there for sure. Well, let's get, Tracy, if you wouldn't mind starting Tim's slides, let's give Tim some time to just kind of give us the overview. And then for anybody watching this on Zoom, if you have a question as Tim's given us this update, please use the question and answer feature at the bottom. If you're on Facebook or social media, put your question in the comments and we'll do our best to get through everybody's questions. So take it away, Tim.
Well, thank you, Karl. This is a quick presentation on what's happening back in Washington, D.C. And usually August is a very quiet period. I mean, that's when people leave town basically and get out and see constituents and get some vacation time. But this August has been really action-packed, lots of stuff going on. So unusual in that context. So first slide. There we go. So the lay of the context here, we have very close margins in Congress. Just to review, the Senate is 50-50. So the Democrats have control because the vice president breaks the tie. The House has just a 3-vote margin for the Democrats, so Speaker Pelosi has a very slim margin to work with to conduct business. And the country itself still divided quite deeply. The popularity polling data right now for the president is about 50-50. And of course, Trump almost won last time. So the country really has a very strong divide right now. We see that reflected in the Congress. And despite that, the Congress is trying to really work on very significant consequential legislation, sort of once in a generation legislation, which I'll summarize here in a second. But again, there'll be some effort to perhaps use the close margins to temper what Congress can accomplish. And you'll see that as part of my theme here. Next slide. So there are 4 big congressional priorities right now we're focused on. Of course, there's about 20 or 30 others that are significant, but these 4 really are significant in the context of game-changing for the country. The first is the bipartisan infrastructure bill. We call it the BIF affectionately back in Washington, D.C. That's currently in play. The second is budget reconciliation. This came off the budget resolution that the Senate and the House have now passed. The next is just the appropriations bills for the next fiscal year, FY22. Of course, they have to fund the federal government. And of course, here in the Tri-Cities, the Hanford site, the laboratory, a lot of federal funding comes to this area. And then we have the debt ceiling, which I'll describe as sort of a wild card. It has to be dealt with sometime this fall as well. So next slide. So starting with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, it's $1.2 trillion. There's various calculations, but that's the one that I think is the best because it keys off what the current authorization numbers already are. The bill is traditional hard infrastructure, and there's been a lot of demand for doing that. We've had several big efforts before that have failed to help modernize our crumbling infrastructure. So the focus is roads and highways and bridges and ports and airports. It includes broadband, it includes transmission. And it really is designed to help make up for lost time with respect to modernizing and improving our infrastructure. The bill passed the Senate. It was a bipartisan bill, got 69 votes in the Senate. I think 19 Republicans voted for it, including McConnell. So it really is a bipartisan effort. It took about 2 months to kind of hammer it out. The House passed this week a rule which creates a deadline for consideration of the Senate passed infrastructure bill, which is September 27. And there's going to be a lot of discussion as a hard deadline or not, but that's the current game plan, is to get the House to consider, take a vote, if you will, on the BIF by September 27. Next slide. Now, we're currently in the middle of budget reconciliation, and that process got started, unlocked, if you will, by a budget resolution that passed the House this week. It passed 220 to 212, very, very close vote. And again, that just is a blueprint that starts the process for reconciliation, which is where the committees get together and figure out the details for the program. Again, it's 3.5 trillion, an enormous amount of money. It's important because as a reconciliation bill, it can pass with just 50 votes in the Senate. It's not required to get a filibuster-proof vote in the Senate. So it need not be bipartisan to pass technically. The bill is focused on human or soft infrastructure, very significant focus on climate, for example, also includes pre-K education programs, college loan programs, includes Medicare expansions, includes childcare and paid family leave, are all part of this comprehensive issue to address sort of the human side of infrastructure. And again, the committees will develop the details, and it'll be a very partisan process. The Republicans will vote no. I think everyone will probably vote no on the package to require the Democrats to carry it across the goal line. And given the close margins, it'll require pretty much all of them to vote for it to get done. Next slide. So FY22 appropriations, we can't forget that funds the federal government. We have 9 spending bills that have passed the House, including the energy and water bill, very important for this area. 3 bills have passed just the Senate committee, including energy and water. They will not get this done before September 30, which is the start of the new fiscal year, and therefore they'll have to pass again, as they have the past several years, a continuing resolution, we call it a CR, that will simply continue funding at the FY21 levels for at least a certain period in FY22. My guess is that they will have to push off the appropriations process until late this year because they have this reconciliation bill going first. It'll consume all their time in Congress. They'll likely finish the year with some sort of, we call it an omni appropriations bill that will pass maybe late November, December timeframe that will fund the federal government. I don't see a government shutdown as being a likely scenario. You never know, but I think both sides have learned their lesson. Those things tend to fail. They don't really provide you any kind of partisan advantage. So I suspect they'll find a way to pass something to keep the federal government going. And hopefully they'll pass the energy and water bill as part of a larger omni package to fund the federal government. I want to stress the energy and water bill, which is one of these 12 bills that they have to pass every year, is really critical for this area. In fact, arguably no congressional district in the country gets more funding from energy and water than does the 4th district, Central Washington District. You look at Department of Energy with the Hanford site, with the laboratory getting significant funding from energy and water as well. Plus you have the dams, you have the Bureau, you have the BPA. They're all part of this energy and water bill. So it really kind of speaks to our priorities in the Tri-Cities. Next slide. Now, the debt ceiling. Technically, the cap was reached July 31, and therefore to avoid a default, Treasury has advanced a series of extraordinary measures to kind of have the federal government float along. And these measures are effective, but they only go for so long. And so we're guessing by October, November, they'll have exhausted those extraordinary measures, and therefore they'll reach the actual physical cap. And that means they have to do something. They have to pass a law that will extend the cap. It's about $30 trillion right now. And this is a wild card because they have to do it. And the Republicans right now aren't going to vote for it, they tell us, and therefore to rely upon Democratic votes. And this does raise the possibility for an economic consequence if they fail to lift the debt ceiling. My guess is they'll probably get there, but it might be somewhat dramatic in the process. So they have this occurring at the same time they have to do the appropriation bills, they have to do the reconciliation bill, also finish off on infrastructure. So there's lots going on, all kind of reach a sort of concentration of activity sometime in the fall, right when they have to extend the debt ceiling as well. So that'll be a complication. So that's the kind of overview presentation. Happy to take questions, obviously, and respond to other points, and love to have a conversation about these important issues. That's just an overlay, and obviously everything we talk about at the federal level, whether it's Hanford cleanup, the laboratory, the dams on the Snake River, for example, all those issues permeate through reconciliation and through the federal project, the federal budget process. So again, that's a context, but all of your issues are very much in play right now at the federal level. I would say for those who want to focus on reconciliation, now's your time. In fact, a little late perhaps because they're writing those as we speak, but you have things you care about, paid family leave, if you care about the pre-K education, now's your time to kind of weigh in and express your views. If you care about taxes too, because they have to pay for part of it, the tax reform. So there'll be a serious effort as well from the Ways and Means Committee in the House to initiate some tax reform, which will probably mean quite frankly tax increases in several areas. So if that concerns you, please do weigh in and express your views to your congressional electeds. With that, I'd be happy to stand down and respond to questions.
I had one I was just thinking of as you ran through it, but the reconciliation budget of 3.5 trillion, which you described as kind of the soft infrastructure, that's in addition to the regular appropriations process that you talked about, right? So that's really separate from the 12 funding bills that are the normal appropriations process.
Yes, absolutely. It's a separate process. That's why it's a generational bill. They have one that size. And again, it's on top of the appropriations process, plus on top of infrastructure. They want to pass the BIF, the bipartisan bill as well. So this is it's basically approaching $5 trillion just with those two big bills before you get to the appropriations bills, which are about 1.5 trillion. So there's a lot of money right now in DC.
Yeah.
And Tim, you mentioned the Snake River dams, and as we've talked about before on this on Coffee with Karl, Congressman Simpson from Idaho's proposal would tear down the dams and then spend $34+ billion as part of the infrastructure package to kind of make up for all the negative impacts that would cause. My understanding is that that hasn't gained any traction as part of the infrastructure bills, but can you share if you know anything more about whether or not that might be in the either infrastructure package?
Not currently. I mean, they've already passed in the Senate the bipartisan bill. It's not in the bipartisan bill, and the House will likely take the Senate bill or make very, very modest changes to it. So that's not part of that larger bipartisan bill. Reconciliation is, again, much larger, and there'll certainly be funding for various ecosystem improvements and very climate focused. So I guess it could be part of the discussion, but at this point, I have no indication that it's in the mix. They've already laid out at least, again, the blueprint and a series of proposals to go into reconciliation. And from what I can tell, it's not currently in play. That could change, obviously. And my guess is that politically, it only becomes viable if there is consensus support from the congressionals, House and Senate, to do it, particularly with the US senators. So I'd watch that process very carefully. It would take that kind of coalescence, if you will, strong unity, at least among the Democratic senators, to do this as part of reconciliation. I don't currently see that, but things can change, obviously, in Washington, D.C. very quickly. So I would encourage everybody who cares about that issue to voice your concerns, and I would focus on the senators in particular, because they are the Democratic Party in Washington and Oregon, and this will be a Democratic process. Again, they're probably going to vote no. And so the ones who will drive the process and have to get the votes for it will be mostly Democrats. And so I'd focus your attention on your senators in particular, and let them know that this would not be a particularly good piece of policy, and should not be in reconciliation.
Tim, how about the, you described it as the BIF. Let's get into that a little bit and tell us a little bit about what you know. We've had some discussions around town about how can we bring our community together to possibly, you know, we hear rumblings that there could be big regional or community-wide grant opportunities coming up in the future. What can you tell us about what you know or what you're hearing in DC about the BIF and some of those maybe like Tri-Cities opportunities out of that infrastructure bill?
Yeah, great question. And again, that bill's going to get done, I suspect. I mean, the reconciliation package is going to be a little dicey because the vote count is very close right now, and some senators have raised concerns about voting for the final $3.5 trillion details. But the BIF, the bipartisan bill for infrastructure, right now it seems to be in pretty good shape. So I think you're smart to think ahead to how that bill will be executed. There'll be a lot of formula funding in that bill. So highway funding for, again, the essential hard infrastructure, bridges, broadband, even some schools, focus as well on transmission, a lot of funding for transmission, for example. So once they pass the bill, they will set up a process to allocate the funding. And communities will certainly be in the mix. Some goes by formula grant to states, and the states will allocate it, but there'll also be a lot of money that'll be available for traditional federal granting. So I think that communities should be thinking ahead to what can they do? What's your priority in the hard infrastructure category, and how you can develop a that's going to be well received by the folks in Washington, D.C., which will be the agencies, quite frankly. And my experience has been that proposals that are, you know, community focused, that reflect a significant support from, you know, broad-based support from the communities, often prevail. And those who even have, you know, broader regional focus, not simply just one community, but in this case, the Tri-Cities or maybe 2 counties or even more, I think that approach that gives you a more regional focus is always very helpful in, I think, get well received. You get better marks, if you will, better scoring as they develop the grant funding priorities at the federal level. So the details are going to be determined. Right now, they're going to put out, you know, several $100 billion accounts, and the priority is going to be what they can do to get that funding allocated. So I think that if I were you, I'd be thinking ahead. Okay, what are our priorities? You know, for the Tri-City community, what can we do to you know, put forward a responsible and effective proposal that could you know, get supported.
Tim, you mentioned consensus, and the other thing I was curious about, the BIF would be different than what we saw 10 or so years ago with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARA, but least back then, but there are some parallels or similarities too, it seems. Back then, there was a real focus on shovel ready and having projects that are ready to go quickly, at least within a 12 to 24 month time period. Do you have a sense that they're going to be looking for projects to fund through the BIF also within that 12 to 24 month time period to be shovel ready, or is it going to look different this time around? Do you know?
I don't know. Certainly job creation is a factor, and there's no question. As we come out of the pandemic, there'll be a heavy focus on what we can do to create economic stimulus. Not quite the same extent though we had, I think, 10 years ago. So I think it'll be probably, that'll be a factor, but not the overwhelming factor. I think there'll be a strong focus on what has enduring value. You know, what can you do that provides an investment for the community that not just has a short-term stimulus, but it has beneficial economic applications for years to come. So I think that's going to be a hallmark for the new approach. You want job creation, but what can you do to have some permanency that it gives you some sustainable economic growth for a community? So I think more in those contexts that will probably get you better position for these large grants to follow from BIF.
Tim, how about just thinking of the strategies and how these pieces of legislation may move through both houses? You talk like the BIF seems like it's a lot more, for sure going to pass, or more sure going to pass, let's say. Is there a chance that they'll try to, or one party will try to combine, the soft infrastructure with the hard infrastructure and say, we're not going to pass this unless we get this? Or do you think they will maybe be separated and the hard infrastructure will go by itself?
Well, that is the central question, quite frankly, as well defined by you. Just to review now, we had a lot of suspense the past week or so in the House, because that was the plan, was to essentially combine the two and use the BIF as leverage to get support for reconciliation, the budget resolution, which again kickstarts the reconciliation process. And that was the Speaker Pelosi's approach. She had a very strong progressive base of her party that was encouraging her to let the BIF be a leverage, because it has broad support, that's bipartisan. The thought was, let's don't pass the BIF right now. If we were just to take the Senate BIF bill and get it done, then we're losing some leverage to get what we want done as well, which includes some of the soft infrastructure on the budget reconciliation bill. So that was the plan, was to essentially defer action on the BIF until after they'd finished entirely the reconciliation process, at least in the Senate. About 10 moderate Democrats objected. They said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to pass the BIF now because it's immediate job creation. There's a stimulus. It's bipartisan. It can go right now. It's non-controversial. Let's just do that and take the benefits and not have to wait. And plus, they were leery about 3.5 trillion, quite frankly. There was too much money, and concerned about some aspects that might flow from that 3.5 trillion. So that therein lied the competing demands that Speaker Pelosi had to navigate. I give her credit, she got it done. She could thread the needle. And again, her compromise was to let the budget resolution go forward, get that vote done, and then have an action forcing event, a date certain for consideration of the BIF. This September 27 day is designed to have an accommodation to let the moderates know, yeah, you'll get your vote on BIF. We'll just delay it by basically a month. But they'll still be fairly early in the queue. So that's what happened. So my point is that the history here is, yes, there is a temptation to combine the two issues and to have them kind of leverage each other to get them done. And we'll see if that can stick or not. There's a lot of pressure still to get it done by September 27. The reality is it may not, because just the mechanics of developing a bill that big, and again, they're so late in doing so, I would bet they can't get it done by this September 27. So that's going to cause, again, a whole review of the process. Okay, well, we're going to miss that deadline. What's our workaround? And are we going to lose the traction we have on BIF? If you're a moderate, you're a progressive, you're saying, well, I need to have BIF held back, and that's the sweetener at the end, if you will. It gives us the incentive to work hard and get reconciliation done as well. So you may find yourself back in the soup with respect to a combining of the bills, and again, the political leverage points later in the fall when they can't meet the deadline. Sort of my prediction as to how it may play out. The worst case scenario is they can't reach a deal and they lose the whole thing. They end up leveraging and playing too aggressively, and they lose the BIF as well. I think that's unlikely, but that certainly is a possibility. I think more likely is that BIF gets deferred, it gets done though, and then the issue will be, can they find the votes to do the bipartisan $3.5 trillion package? And there, if I was forced to bet, I would say maybe, but at a lower number, because at least 2 Democrats in the Senate, Manchin, West Virginia, and Sinema, Arizona, have said very clearly and repeated it several times that they will not vote for 3.5 trillion. So if they don't vote for it, it can't pass, just given the numbers in the Senate. And so at some point in the process, they have to find a way to bring that number down or pay for more of it, perhaps, to accommodate their fiscal concerns. So that therein lies a lot of uncertainty as to how the process may play out. And it's going to be very interesting for those of us who watch politics and get our juices flowing on the suspense it creates. This is going to be a very interesting fall as all the issues have to come to a head and get done during Q4.
I can appreciate the perspective from a political junkie. I maybe think of myself as being a little bit one of those as well. Well, and you mentioned earlier how much funding that our region receives, especially on the energy and water bill, for Hanford, for PNNL, and then outside of energy and water, for large projects like the Yakima Basin project or the Columbia Basin project on the irrigation side. And I know that we don't have as much definition yet on the larger $3.5 trillion bill, but do you have any insights as to where there might be some opportunities for funding, either for additional support for Hanford cleanup, for the work that PNNL does, or even for some of these large irrigation projects that have a lot of infrastructure needs as well?
Yeah, great question. I don't know the details yet. All we have are allocations that have gone to individual committees and big picture policy proposals. More EM funding for Hanford is not currently in the mix. That could change, obviously. Committees of jurisdiction over Hanford cleanup do get fair allocations, pretty good sums of money. So they certainly have the capacity to do it, but they have a long laundry list of things they want to do before Hanford, in my view. So I'm not quite sure Hanford cleanup is in the mix as part of the reconciliation process. I think that laboratory infrastructure is in the mix. That's probably a better area because that kind of fits the metrics for doing efforts to modernize infrastructure. The House Science Committee, for example, has $45 billion as part of this allocation under reconciliation. I'm told about 15 billion of that's going to be in the sort of energy R&D sector. And so certainly there could be efforts made to provide additional funds to modernize the laboratories, the national laboratories, and provide them more funding for, again, long overdue infrastructure. So that would certainly be, I think, an area where you may see some tangible benefits, for PNNL, for example. On the resource area, the Natural Resources Committee in the House does have a fair allocations too, good number for them. I think it's mostly, by the way, for climate-related and ecological restoration-related activities. But certainly there would be the possibility for having some of that money go for reclamation, for more irrigation activities, maybe perhaps for efforts to improve the capacity of hydro, since hydro is renewable. So yeah, that's in the mix. That could be a possibility. And again, those who advocate for those priorities, now's your time. Certainly make your voice known that if you have a resource priority or a laboratory priority or any other priority that kind of fits the metrics of improving our infrastructure as well as dealing with climate, then this is your time. And climate definitely is a theme for this sort of second package on infrastructure, dealing with the so-called human soft infrastructure. And that's a major reason why progressives pushed it, because they want to have this once in a generation vehicle to legislate significant policy changes to reduce CO2. And there's no question that's a big driver. So if you have a project that fits that narrative, definitely I get your issue in play.
Tim, in the infrastructure bill and the BIF, are there also those same kind of parameters that they're going after, the whole, you know, carbon reduction in the atmosphere? Is there a lot of similar language or themes in both packages?
Yes, but that bill's already passed essentially, so
Yeah,
taken care of, and they do have some climate issues in that bill, but they're more modest, if you will, whereas the reconciliation package, that is the comprehensive, really home run opportunity for climate advocates is that legislation. So again, I looked at that bill, quite frankly, as the place to play if you have a climate driven initiative. And again, BIF's already pretty much fully baked. So that's kind of gone by the wayside for now. I focus on the reconciliation if you have something that's really climate focused. Now, for one example is there are proposals for a clean electricity standard to meet the objectives of the administration to have net zero. So that's out there as a comprehensive scheme to create a federal program to set targets and therefore have things flow from that targets in terms of use of clean technologies to ensure we can have electricity that's carbon free by a date certain. So that's definitely part of the thinking. And if you can get that done, then that creates the mandate basically to get everything else to flow, including a lot more clean technology, renewables, and also a means to get those renewables to the market, which includes more transmission.
you know, in the BIF, that just reminded me of something, Tim. In Washington State, WashDOT, the transportation budget, a big driver right now statewide is mainly focused on the west side, which is fish passage through culverts. You know, the state lost this lawsuit and has to every year, a big part of the state transportation budget goes into that fish passage. Do you know, out of the BIF, would there be any specifics that would help with that? You know, because I think on this side of the mountains, as we look at just even maintaining the roads that we've got, let alone new highway projects, the state budget right now, they're kind of like underwater, if you will, on fish passage, and then also like the ferry fleet and stuff where ridership's down and, you know, still have ongoing costs. So any insights in the BIF? Would there be any help for like fish passage for the whole state?
Yes, I'm glad you raised that. Culverts are definitely part of BIF. They're referenced specifically several times. There'll be a lot of funding, I'm sure, will flow to help communities and states deal with that issue to address fish passage. There's also specific language on ferries to add more infrastructure and support for ferries. And of course, I think we have the largest ferry fleet in the country in Washington State, so we should certainly benefit from that. And there are also just related environmental improvements with our ecosystems. Chesapeake Bay, for example, the Everglades, and also some Puget Sound folks, their efforts to improve their ecosystems. There's some funding for all three of those sectors, for example, in the country. And salmon is certainly part of it. It's not to the degree that was proposed by the Simpson proposal, but there is healthy funds that are in play to deal with efforts to restore salmon runs and deal specifically with culverts. That's just, there's no question that's an issue, and you're right. We have court cases that have mandates in that regard, yet there's no funding to get it done. So this creates at least a partial funding mechanism, I think, to address that element of the efforts to restore salmon runs.
Oh, that's great. Maybe just going on that a little bit further. So it sounds like there would possibly be some money for the Corps of Engineers on, say, the lower Snake River dams. And I know that they've spent a lot of money and they've done some great improvements for fish passage, but there might even be some more opportunities to enhance that. I know next Tuesday I get a chance to go on a tour up through Ice Harbor Dam, up through the lock, and then we're going to look at the fish passage stuff on the dam. I'm excited to go. We'll look at it and learn more about it, but might be some money there too for the Corps as well. Yes,
there could be. I'll have to dig into it in more detail. I don't recall it listed specifically. I mean, the BIF's a 1,000-page bill, so yes. Sifting through the details, even the summary was 100 pages. So, but I'll look at the Army Corps and see if there's more in there for the Army Corps. I recall that the focus was more on culverts and on dealing with specified ecosystems as a means of dealing with these kinds of environmental areas. And there was a little bit of funding, I believe, for for dam improvements and dam restoration in the context of it being, clean energy. And if we can get more capacity from existing dams, that would be a good approach to deal with the climate issue and also create, again, modernized infrastructure.
Yeah.
And Tim, I'm curious, kind of stepping away from just talking about the 4 priorities that Congress is going to be working on over the next few months. We have another year, give or take a little bit over a year before the midterm elections. Do you have a sense of what other items might be on Congress's agenda? There's been talk about immigration reform, a number of other sort of major bills that might move. They seem like they've maybe taken a backseat to all of the other things that we've been talking about so far, but a sense of what else might be on the congressional agenda?
Well, once we get through the big 4, then we can take a deep breath and think about what they might do next year. Immigration certainly is an issue. They may try to do some immigration on reconciliation. They'll face some obstacles because of the so-called Byrd rule in the Senate, which requires that the policy have some relevance to the deficit and revenue. But they might try. Dreamers might be part of the discussion. But my guess is they'll have to wait and do those immigration proposals next year. The problem with doing things next year is it's election year, as you point out. And the trite and tired phrase in DC is that you do things in odd years because they've just been elected. But even years are very difficult to legislate in a comprehensive way because they're all worried about their re-elections. And the voters are more focused on just what was accomplished most recently, and therefore it has electoral consequences. And so members become often reluctant to vote for significant change during even years, which of course would be in 22. So that's why this year is very, very important. But there'll be stuff next year as well. When they can't get done this year, they'll try again to legislate when they can. On the immigration front, besides the Dreamers, certainly there's a significant effort afoot to deal with the guest worker issue, H-2A program issue. And so I would see that as a possibility. New House has a bill on that. It's passed the House. And so that would be in play, I'm sure. In fact, it's even possibly maybe in play as part of reconciliation. So there's a lot out there to deal with beyond just the big 4. I might add, though, that if reconciliation gets done, big if, but if it gets done at the level that's been talked about, that will help sort of reduce the priorities, at least on the Democratic side, because if they get it done, you'll have paid family leave, you'll have pre-K, you'll have childcare, more childcare financial incentives, you'll have Medicare expansions for things like vision and hearing aids for the elderly, and you'll have programs on education, even for college loans, among many others, quite frankly. So you'll have kind of cleaned the slate on those priorities, and therefore that will reduce what's left to work on, quite frankly, for next year from the Democratic point of view. And also we'll deal with tax reform because again, they'll have to pay for part of it, and that will clean out the decks probably in a whole variety of tax reform issues that they don't have to worry about next year. Having said that, immigration remains definitely a bugaboo, and I would expect it to be on the list of priorities, but I question whether it can get done, certainly in a consequential way, during an election year.
And kind of following on that theme of some of the broad swath of issues that are being addressed and maybe to try to sort of clean the slate, one of the things that we've been seeing here, as you know, Tim, over the last few years is just there's been such enormous growth. The population of the Tri-Cities, we're seeing record shortages and availability of housing. Housing prices are going up, things like that. And affordable housing maybe looks different here than it does in larger metropolitan areas, but it's becoming, I think, a even greater issue across the country. So I'm curious, do you know if there's any affordable housing measures that are either part of either of these infrastructure bills or potentially other work that Congress might be doing?
Yes, very much so. Reconciliation in particular will have a number of affordable housing initiatives. And I should have mentioned that earlier, quite frankly. It's certainly an issue that we face throughout the communities that are growing fast in particular. But yes, there'll be programs, there'll be incentive programs, there will be tax reform programs, other things to do a better job with respect to getting affordable housing in these communities. So yes, that's an area that'll be a priority for reconciliation. It's not too much in BIF, but I see it as being really a significant issue as part of reconciliation. And if they don't get reconciliation done, then it will come back, I'm sure, as part of a priority for next year. Also, tax reform is part of it. There are bills out there that would create incentives for converting unused buildings in urban areas for other purposes, including affordable housing. So that's also out there, creating tax incentives basically, or other ways to encourage those who own these structures in urban areas to think about converting them into other types of housing.
Tim, I think we talked about it yesterday, but from the Democrats' point of view, the reconciliation $3.5 trillion bill, is this kind of their, I don't want to say moonshot, you know, kind of like President Johnson's Great Society or President Roosevelt's New Deal program? Is this, I guess we hear it a little bit on the news, but what's the word on the street back in DC? Is that part of the big push, is like, we have these societal issues, we want to deal with it all in one shot? Is that kind of what the thought is, or the theme?
Yeah, very much so. This is the chance for Democratic priorities to step up. And it's being put that way by the Speaker and by Schumer, who leads the Senate, and by Joe Biden. This is very much their time. And it just reflects where the politics are in terms of the House and Senate. I mean, the legislature, you need to have your majorities in power. And the Democrats have slim majorities, House and Senate, and of course they have Biden to sign the bill. So this is their chance to do, you should have the moonshot, do the comprehensive generational legislation that can get done. And so that's definitely what's going on here. And Speaker Pelosi, I think, worked it very effectively. And part of her mantra was, this is our chance. We were elected to lead. It's a slim majority. We are the majority. The reconciliation process affords us a rare opportunity. There's just 50 votes in the Senate to get this done. Before, you had to worry about the filibuster and had to be bipartisan to get things done. You have to have some Republicans on board to pass a bill in the Senate. Usually, you have to have 60 votes to break a filibuster. But reconciliation is this very novel process that happens once a year, sometimes twice a year, if they can finagle a few details, that allows you to do things with less than the filibuster-proof margin in the Senate. So that's what the thought process is. And Pelosi has told her caucus many times, this is our time, and we should not lose this opportunity. That was the message of the moderate Democrats. You know, come with us. We were elected to provide leadership and advance our priorities, and this is our chance to do it. And this is the way that the game's played back in Washington, D.C. Of course, we saw under Trump, when they had their chance, when they had a fragile majority, they pushed through tax reform. That was their big priority. Under Obama, he pushed through Obamacare, if you will. Again, the same issue on reconciliation. That's the vehicle they used to pass these sort of very comprehensive, game-changing pieces of legislation. And so, yes, there's no question that's exactly what's going on here. And I actually, Pelosi's doing what she should do. That's what a speaker should do. She should lead. And if she can find a way to get the votes, if she can thus far, she'd prove that. Absolutely. Why not shoot for the moon?
Yeah. We do have a question from the audience, and it's about the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill. And can you talk a little bit about that, and if it's going to pass, or if it's within this conversation, budget that we're talking about?
Well, yeah, great question. The Comprehensive Voting Rights Act has passed the House. It's in the Senate and will not pass the Senate as currently configured. And again, it's the issue. It requires 60 votes in the Senate, and the Republicans are not going to vote for the bill. So that takes care of that. However, there has been some talk about, could they get this into reconciliation? Probably not, because again, the Byrd rule, which kind of cleanses the process and requires the process to focus on sort of fiscal matters, would probably keep it off of the reconciliation. Now, having said that, part of the rule that passed the House this week, and it was artfully done by Speaker Pelosi, was to have that big vote they took, the 220 to 212 vote. That vote included voting rights legislation, not the John Lewis bill per se, but something similar, sort of a John Lewis light bill, if you will, with respect to voting rights. And that was put there as a sweetener because it was an effort to have Democrats vote for an important priority with respect to voting rights. And that was, again, trying to squeeze some of the moderate Democrats, basically saying, you got to vote for this because one more additional value in doing so is to advance voting rights. So yeah, that's part of the mix that the House will now put in play. But again, the bill they put in play is a much more modest effort, and it's not clear it'll get done. It might drop out, but it was all part of an artful way to put that in the rule to create additional political leverage and cover, if you will, for Democrats to vote for it. So it's definitely in the mix, but I don't think it'll probably get done, at least not in a comprehensive way. At least now it could change next Congress, or if events play out that creates more public support for it. But given the current dynamics, I would say probably not. At least not the John Lewis variety.
And Tim, we only have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to ask you another question. Kind of, I'm not sure if you brought your crystal ball with you when you came to the Tri-Cities, but looking longer term, obviously, our federal missions, especially at Hanford, are decades long into the future. And we know that there's going to be some peaks in the next even decade where there's going to need to be additional funding for certain work at Hanford and maybe some valleys too beyond. But overall, the mission at Hanford is still going to require very significant expenditures and possibly, at least barring any sort of changes in the technology or the approach, ever increasing expenditures. And we're talking about a lot of spending right now, up to $4.5+ trillion. And I don't know if there's any way to predict, because spending fatigue could change and elections can change things a lot, of course. But when we look 5, 10, 15 years into the future and the prognosis for continued strong funding for our priorities, especially on maybe trickier issues like Hanford cleanup, do you have any sort of prognosis or thoughts on what that might look like?
For Hanford cleanup, it is a difficult issue, there's no question. I think there is some fatigue that set in, and I think it would be in our best interest to find ways to accelerate cleanup, reduce the cost, and use technology as a driver. That's sort of where I am on the issue personally, and I think that that's where much in Congress is as well, that we're happy to provide the resources. It has to be done. There's a moral responsibility. I think that's all very fair and appropriate. But I think at some point you have to understand that there are fiscal limitations here, and we have to add a dose of reality in terms of cleanup going forward. So without any way doing any kind of shortcuts on health and safety, and in no way trying to minimize our TPA commitments, trying to facilitate the tri-party agreement and stay on task with the milestones, we should be thinking about ways that allow us to use technology, new innovation as a way to get cleanup done in our lifetimes, quite frankly, as well as maybe at a lower cost over time. So that sounds like a good idea, hard to execute, obviously, but I think that's the kind of narrative that we should be moving towards. I know that TRIDEC's been a real leader in this effort, along with other communities that have similar facilities in their areas, that we need to think about. This is not supposed to be a never-ending program. It's supposed to reach a completion point that allows us to get things cleaned up and then allow us to move on with a variety of diversity and economic activities for our region. I think that's an important message, and I would encourage people to stay on that message and work it, because that to me is where we're headed. And I think that politically in Washington, D.C. as well, we should be mindful of what the reality is with respect to the resources required for cleanup, and can we find a way to get those resources more aligned with what is practically achievable in the Congress, as well as what actually gets cleanup accomplished through acceleration and less cost. So that's my big mantra, my big statement on cleanup. There's details to follow, obviously, but I think that's an important message that we shouldn't lose sight of.
It's a great point. As we were talking, and then just, where we started off in our conversation here, Tim, that we're almost wrapped up with, I was just thinking about, with your perspective on DC and how things are going back there. Your slides talked about what we obviously feel every day, that we're, as a nation, we're pretty divided. What's it like in DC? I just think of stories I've heard over the years that, even people that we all read about in history books, that served in the Senate, for instance, that go toe to toe on the floor, over legislation or something, but then they still had some air of collegiality. They were still able to hang out together, if you will, or something. Has that changed? I know it's a pretty broad question, but have we moved away from, I think what our government's kind of built on, right? That we all have this common goal. We love our country. We want to go back and get things done. Legislative bodies compromise. That's kind of our goal here. So let's go do it. Has that changed, or what's your feeling on the atmosphere, I guess, back in DC?
It has changed. And when I was a congressional staffer way back in the day, there was a lot more collegiality. Staffers worked together. There was more bipartisanship, I think. There was a sense that we're all together, and a lot more ability to kind of work together, I think, is what the hallmark was back then. Delegates from Washington State has a very long tradition, by the way, of working together. We still have much of that today, but I think overall in the Congress, there is more polarization and more divisiveness, and it's just more partisan process. It's disappointing, quite frankly, and it's not as much fun, quite frankly. And I think a lot of congressional staffers today are not as happy. They're not doing quite what they want to do. It's a balkanized system. It kind of careens back and forth depending upon the election results. One party gets in power, they go for it. Other party then they go too far. Other party comes back in and they go too far on their agenda. And so the middle sometimes loses its focus as the two extremes end up playing against each other. So that's a frustrating part of it. So it's definitely changed in Washington, D.C. The members don't really have the mentality you described. When I was up there, the old mantra was, as I recall, was that Tip O'Neill, of course, who was a legendary speaker, and Ronald Reagan, they would go toe to toe, but after 5 o'clock, they'd have a drink in the evening together. So I think we've lost that, and lots of reasons for that. I mean, part of that, most of the families for the congressionals are not based in Washington, D.C. They stay back in their congressional districts. When in the old days, many of the families grew up together in Washington, D.C. And so the wives knew each other and the kids knew each other, and that created some sense of community among the congressionals. They used to travel together before they do these so-called codels, and members would go together on trips. And it's a great way to connect with your colleague on the other side, if you will, to be with them and see them in a more social setting and travel with them. And you begin to understand them better and see them as a colleague as opposed to a political enemy, for example. Those are just two illustrations, I think, of how things have changed in the Congress. I mean, I'm struck, and so are many freshman congressmen that come to the Congress, that on day one, they immediately split up. And the Republicans go in one corner, Democrats in the other corner. They have separate caucus meetings. They do separate, in the beginning of the year, discussion sessions and laying out their agenda, their so-called retreats. And those are all done within their own party. So from day one, they get split up. And that's, I think, from my standpoint, not where it should be. One last point, since I see time is running out, there are efforts afoot to change that. I mean, there are so-called problem solver caucuses. There are other caucuses of moderate members on both sides who want to come together and provide a message to the entire Congress, House and Senate, that we can work together. The bipartisan so-called BIF bill, that was an illustration where you had 20 senators who on both sides who got together and did the deal and got the White House to agree. So that was a good example of bipartisanship. And you've had several House caucus groups that have come together. And in fact, the moderate Democratic group was trying to be a pioneer with respect to how you could do this having the center be more involved in development legislation, not the one extreme of the party, if you will. So there are efforts afoot to go back to where I think it ought to be, but there's a long way to go because the town right now is very partisan, and that results in, at least in my standpoint, not the best legislation. I mean, the best legislation is bipartisan because it has enduring value. It won't flip from year to year or election to election. And that's what tends to have staying power. So hopefully we'll return to the day when we have efforts to have both sides work together in a bipartisan way and have the middles, if you will, of both parties be more ability to influence the process. And that hopefully will give us better results and over time a better country.
That's really well said. And I think when we talked about getting together and have this conversation today, especially after yesterday, I think you made the comment like, well, I'm not going to end on, some bad news. So I think you really turned that one around. That was great. You gave us some lights at the end of the tunnel, if you will. I think that was really well said. Well, we are at the end of our hour together, and Tim, as always, it's just so great to talk to you. And you're really a part of our team. You talked about how we were your first client and your favorite one. We appreciate that, and just the relationship that we have. To have you back representing our whole community in DC is really an honor for us, and you do a great job for us. We appreciate your time. You want to leave us with any closing remarks as we sign off?
Well, just to say that the honor is all mine. As you said before, being a lobbyist, it's a profession which has honor, and part of the honor is to advocate for such great clients like TRIDEC and the community as a whole. So it is my honor, my pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity, and hope that there'll still be many more good years to come. And working as a team, we can unite around key priorities for the region and advance those effectively in Washington, D.C. And as I said, for years and years, pound for pound, no group has more sway in DC than does TRIDEC. And I mean that seriously. I mean, certainly in our senators' offices and in the congressman's office, new House office, when TRIDEC speaks, they listen because they know that TRIDEC is very much the voice of the community. You've done the heavy lifting. You've found the priorities. You've galvanized the support among the community. Otherwise, you wouldn't advance the proposal. And so therefore, you're giving the congressionals a sense of what the real priority is, and you've done the work for them, basically. So that's a real tribute to TRIDEC, and I think the legacy continues on from the days of Sam Vopentest, and it's, again, my honor to be part of this team.
Thanks, Tim. David, I should have given you a chance to make some closing remarks, but anything to add to Tim's comments?
No, just I would echo what you said, Karl. It's been a pleasure in the 4+ years that I've been at TRIDEC to work with Tim on a more regular basis, although we hung out occasionally before that too. But thanks from my perspective to Tim for all that you do for us and the work that we do together. So I appreciate that, and look forward to rolling with the punches as they come in the next few months and years.
Definitely. All right. Thanks a lot, Tim. Have a great weekend and have a safe trip home when you head back to DC. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you.